Welcome to This Explainer. You know, whenever we watch a perfectly executed play on the field, it's easy to focus entirely on the physical stuff, the speed, the sheer strength, the agility. But have you ever wondered what really goes into it behind the scenes? Today, we're going to uncover how those physical movements in sports are actually just the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface, every single pass, sprint, and swing is driven by some pretty profound societal forces, along with incredibly intricate mental gears. Let's set the stakes right out of the gate with a really powerful observation from Nelson Mandela. He recognized that sports are way more than just a game. They actually act as a cultural hammer, capable of breaking down the world's most rigid barriers. From inspiring hope to uniting entirely different groups of people, sports literally operate on a massive global scale. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll be covering sports beyond the physical, the sociological lens, shaping culture inequality, the psychological lens, and finally, mastering the mental game. Let's get into it. Section 1. Sports beyond the physical, the micro and macro lenses. To really grasp this topic, we first need to understand the two very different but equally important ways experts study human movement in the field of kinesiology. Experts rely on what's called a two lenses approach. First, you've got the sociology of sport, which is our macro lens. This one zooms out to look at the big picture, how society, culture, and massive social structures interact with athletics. Then, sharply contrasting that global scale, is the psychology of sport. This is the micro lens, which zooms right in on the intimate scale of a single athlete's mind, looking closely at their individual thoughts, emotions, and mind-body connections. It's fascinating to see how these two fields actually evolved in parallel over the decades. Going all the way back to 1898, Norman Triplett conducted the very first sports psychology experiment. He proved that cyclists actually ride faster when they have a competitor right next to them, a phenomenon known as social facilitation. Then in the 1920s, Coleman Griffith laid down the foundation for coaching psychology. Fast forward a bit to 1972, and we see a massive sociological shift with the passing of Title IX in the United States, which legally prohibited sex-based discrimination in education and sports. Over the years, milestones like these shifted sports from just simple playground games into legitimate, heavily researched academic disciplines. Section 2. The sociological lens, society in the arena. Let's start by looking strictly through that macro lens, zooming out from the individual athlete to the stadium crowd and society at large. So, the absolutely crucial thing to grasp here is that sports basically function as a giant mirror for human civilization. They actively embody our cultural norms and values, acting as a stage where our beliefs are showcased. But at the exact same time, they reflect our deepest issues right back at us, things like socioeconomic disparities, political shifts, and racial justice. When you look at the arena, you are quite literally looking directly at society. Now, because society is so wildly complex, sociologists rely on 5 main theories to objectively analyze what's going on. They don't just pick one viewpoint, they use all of these to get the full picture. The functionalist theory looks at how sports create community, like how the NFL gives fans a shared sense of belonging. The conflict theory is all about economics, noting how expensive sports, like golf, create high financial barriers to entry. The critical theory examines power dynamics, studying why certain groups might get way more media coverage. The feminist theory focuses on gender equality, tracking women breaking barriers in historically male-dominated sports. And finally, the interactionist theory looks at the meaning we pull from everyday interactions, like how a soccer player learns to manage their temper and identity after a really rough foul. Section 3. Shaping culture and equality, the power of policy. Now let's explore how sports policies don't just reflect our culture, but actually actively shape it, specifically focusing on the drive for gender equality. The data around this is just striking. It proves the massive ripple effect of sports legislation. When Title IX passed in 1972, the most visible impact was giving females the opportunity to participate in school athletics. But looking at the numbers, the impact went way further. In 1972, women earned just 44% of bachelor's degrees. By 2019, that number skyrocketed to 58%, far outpacing men. Sociologists point to this as clear-cut evidence that expanding access in the gym and on the field helps drive huge educational and cultural achievements across the board. However, even with all that progress, sociologists also track some seriously persistent challenges. Impartially speaking, unequal opportunities definitely still exist, particularly in sports historically associated with privilege, like winter sports, where the equipment and travel are crazy expensive. Experts also study the ongoing lack of minority representation in off-field roles, coaching and management. And zooming out even further, they analyze how the intense commercialization of sports can sometimes prioritize corporate profit over fair competition. That makes the whole industry pretty vulnerable to massive integrity issues, like the infamous 2015 FIFA bribery scandal. So, through the macro lens, it's clear that sports are still very much a work in progress. We've talked a lot about how sports shape the world and reflect society's massive structures. But to truly understand kinesiology, we have to ask, what happens internally? We've got to zoom in from those massive societal structures down to the solitary individual. Section 4. The psychological lens, gears of the mind. This brings us right to our second lens, where we investigate the mental processing that actually drives athletic performance. If sociology is a mirror, think of psychology as a gear train. Imagine the mind and body as interlocked gears. If one single gear, say a mental component like severe performance anxiety or stress, grinds to a halt, it impacts the successful movement of the entire train. The whole athletic machine breaks down. Sports psychologists are basically the mechanics who work to ensure all these mental and physical gears are spinning smoothly together. All of this interconnectedness directly feeds into motivation, which is what gets those gears turning in the first place. Psychologists divide this into two main camps. First, there's extrinsic motivation. This is when you're driven by external rewards, wanting to win the trophy, getting praise from a coach, or earning a massive paycheck. But on the flip side is intrinsic motivation. Sports psychologists actually consider this to be the absolute purest form of motivation, simply because it's completely self-regulated. It comes from your own internal personal growth and just the sheer, unadulterated joy of doing the activity itself. Section 5. Mastering the mental game. Applied psychology. So if the gears do get stuck, if anxiety takes over or motivation completely drops, how do we actually go about fixing them? Well, that is exactly where mental skills training, or MST, comes in. These are highly practical techniques athletes use to master their internal environment. Step 1 is self-talk, which just involves using positive, instructional keywords to direct your attention during a really crucial moment. Step 2 is imagery, where you create a deeply detailed mental experience of success. And this is wild. Researchers in one study found that just practicing imagery by vividly visualizing shooting basketball free throws actually improved an athlete's accuracy almost as much as physically shooting them on the court every single day. Finally, there's mindfulness, which is the practice of staying fully present in the moment to manage stress and support overall mental health. But here's where things get really cool, because this is where the micro and macro lenses beautifully overlap. Sports psychologists know that for mental skills training to truly work, it definitely can't be one size fits all. It has to be inclusive. Practitioners actively encourage athletes to personalize these techniques using their own cultural symbols. They adapt the language and the metaphors they use to match the athlete's specific background. They might even involve family members or community leaders just to create a culturally familiar and safe environment. Because at the end of the day, the mind doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's heavily shaped by the community it comes from. To get the absolute best, most accurate picture of an athlete, researchers combine 5 distinct psychological perspectives. They look at the affective state, which is all about our moods and feelings; the biological perspective, which studies the literal physical chemistry of the mind-body connection; the cognitive perspective, examining memory and higher-order thought; the personality perspective, looking at an individual's totally unique traits; and finally, the social perspective, investigating how group dynamics influence the individual. They recognize that biology, feelings, and social settings are just constantly interacting with each other to drive our physical behavior. As we bring the macro lens of sociology and the micro lens of psychology together, it becomes crystal clear that sports are incredibly profound human expressions. They're both mirrors of our society and the gear trains of our individual minds. So I want to leave you with a provocative thought to consider the next time you step onto a court, a field, or into a gym. How are your own physical activities being shaped by the societal norms around you? And what are the true internal motivations driving your mental gears? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the game beyond the field.